Hello and welcome to Fireside Chats, a new series where I sit down with the co-founders of SoPro and talk about different topics related to demand generation. Today we're going to be talking about building audiences, data and targeting. And my first question is for you, Rob. So how are companies building lists of data now, and is there a right or a wrong way to do it?
Yes, there is a right and a wrong way. I don't necessarily know how every other company is doing it. I know how we do it here. I think one of the key things is how much more important it's become over the last 5 or 10 years, and really the companies that are doing it well are the ones who are evolving and becoming more accurate. In reality, 10 years ago, there was no real negative to having a massively irrelevant audience. You know, if you were sending to 1,000 people and half of them were out of scope, worst thing that happened is a few emails bounced and that was it. You roll forward to today, the negative impact of sending to the wrong people, you're annoying people, they're marking you as spam, your emails are bouncing. If your list is out of date, they're in the wrong job, hugely outweigh the positives. And therefore, with necessity being the mother of invention, the need to target people way more accurately has become increasingly important. And so that's when, where it used to be the case of finding out companies, industries, so company sizes and job titles, that was an audience. Right now it's much more important to find out if people are in a buying cycle, who else is in the buying committee, if they're the right kind of company and they're actually using technologies that are linked to what you do, and really to eliminate all of the people who don't fit.
So do you think in the last 5 years, and maybe Ryan, this is one for you, that you can reach more people by building lists in a better way? What are your thoughts?
So I think, the access to data has definitely changed the game in the last 5 years. It's probably fair to say that most businesses have access to more or less all the prospects out there in one way or another. And there's a lot of tech around layering additional data points. But if you take, we've got lots of clients that we run campaigns for, and some of those have got upwards of 1 million prospects in their total addressable market, for example. So you can build your audience on one hand, but that is quite different to building your campaign audience on the other hand, because if you've got 1 million prospects, the reality of your monthly cadence is you're not going to get to a point where you can reach out to all of those over, let's say, a 6 or 7 month period. And building your campaign audiences then becomes a matter of prioritisation from within your qualified audience. So that for me is where all of the additional data points that tech is making available, and some of those are increasingly sort of AI-based data points and things you can infer about a company or an individual, their recent activity, for example, is those things that are becoming more and more relevant as you're feeding audiences into campaigns. And the other thing with campaign volumes now are probably trending towards a lower monthly volume being optimal, but with a really rich multi-channel outreach model. That's then, the key there is how do you select the right ones to prioritise. So sort of two different sides to audience building for me.
Interesting. You mentioned about AI there. I'm interested to hear how you think AI has impacted list building, maybe positive and negative ways, if there are any.
Yeah, there's some I can talk about, and then Rob's probably got sort of deeper view on the tech side. But I'll give you an example. So we're one thing that we're doing all of the companies in our database. We've scraped the websites for all of those once a month, and we'll formulate a AI summarised version of who they are, what they do, the company profile, etc. And then that's then a searchable data set that we can use for just additional targeting within campaigns. So it's one example. There's plenty of others. Just simply appending data points to every company record, for example. Do they do this or do they do that for unique criteria that might be in scope for one campaign or another. Lots of. And then even beyond just the data, there's probably 7 or 8 other points within sort of campaign management that AI is being fed into as well.
I think what sometimes gets lost when looking at audience targeting and rolling in AI is, sometimes the focus is on the technology, where in reality, there's no new data points. There's no new information. This has already existed. It's existed forever, pre-AI or pre kind of even bulk emailing. it would be SDRs, and they would go and they'd find, they'd look at someone's profile. Have they recently started in this job? Are they likely to be a good candidate? Has this company recently grown their sales department and investing in sales tech? And all of this stuff already existed, but it was just quite hard to build into a data set. And when we started SoPro, there was a huge amount of manual work. I mean, 10 years ago, we could look at those data points, some of them, and someone would manually do that and manually QA a record, and it worked and produced really good results, but was expensive. And so what AI has done is it's brought the cost of being able to do some of that research down, which then makes it more available and makes sort of the ability to build those targeted data sets within the reach of people without having dedicated SDR teams.
I think it's a performance factor with AI as well. So where those data points come into play, obviously you can use them for filtering and targeting quite effectively. It's not really being used in isolation there though, because you can then feed through, if you take some of those summarised website descriptions, for example, that might be produced by AI or other AI-driven data points, and actually feed them into message generation. What you're then able to do is, you can really complement that other end of the campaign. When messages are landing, you've got these really tailored messages that are just totally unique for every recipient. And again, that it starts with the data, really augmenting it with AI, and then that flows through pretty much every point of the campaign.
There's still a balance though. Like my favourite subject are AI SDR companies, and I think there's this tendency to go AI is going to solve everything, where it doesn't. It brings down the cost of fairly easy, repeatable processes, but there's still huge benefits to be had around humans looking at things and actually making real decisions and having real conversations. And it's more about the blend of these, and really any kind of prospecting activity should be looked at as how do you maximise the time of your salespeople talking to people and doing the really valuable stuff, and how can you augment that with AI, rather than there feels to be a bit of a gold rush at the moment around trying to replace that with AI, and it's just not proving particularly good.
Yeah, I completely understand. I think when you're building that targeting list and you're using AI, sometimes people can be a bit like, do you know if the data's correct? But I guess from a human point of view, what's online is what's online, so there's not really much difference between an AI reading it or someone that's just checking online. If the AI doesn't know any better, then the human wouldn't know any better to use that information that's publicly available.
It's exactly that, and it's entirely about how you feed it. Because if you're feeding an AI summariser strict information that we know is factual, it's brilliant at summarising it. If you start relying on the inherent knowledge, then you very quickly start to get made up facts and put in crazy kind of made up terms, and veers off into unknown territory.
Yeah, great. And what would you say your advice would be to a company that doesn't know its ideal client profile, doesn't know who its targeting should be? What advice would you give? Where would you start?
If you don't know your ideal client profile, I'd probably put that pretty high on the list.
Yeah.
You need to figure that out before you start investing in any sort of marketing, let's be honest, and even your own website. How would you go about it? I think you can externally source support for those sorts of things, or you'd need the expertise in-house to figure it out. But that's definitely a starting position. I mean, to be honest, if you're starting from scratch, LinkedIn's probably a good place to start, because you can tinker about with searches there, can't you? You can start to look at different industries, different company size brackets, and next layer down prospect details and the profile types, and I think you can get a sense, and that will obviously show you a live panel of all of the prospects meeting the search criteria that you're putting in. If you're really starting from ground zero, that will give you a sense of the kind of people that, when you put those criteria in, those criteria points are ultimately what are going to drive an initial audience search. That's usually step one, and then you sort of layer on sort of secondary, tertiary, either company level or profile level search points and filters on top. I'd start there. In terms of generating your lists, I mean, there's probably 1 million data companies out there now that you can acquire data from. I'd say be careful. Don't buy lists beyond what you need. Don't buy a year's worth of data now. We learned years ago that you've got this sort of half-life property of data lists where they do, and you can imagine if people change roles every couple of years, for example, after 1 year, 50% of your list might be out of date. You can break it down to, what does that mean? Almost monthly, are you seeing a 10% sort of degradation in your the quality of your data and the suitability of the prospect? So, I think it's important to refresh those lists, and that whether that's done live, almost list building as you need for outreach, or in sort of smaller batches, just to avoid that investment in outreach into audiences that are no longer in scope.
Yeah,
I think it's also quite rare. You don't really speak to anyone who has no idea who their ICP is. It's about the level of detail they know it.
Right.
I think any company, I can't remember ever talking to a company that doesn't have an idea of the kind of size of company they attract or the industry that they tend to work well with. But it's then what are the next steps? What are the departments and job titles within those? What are the, like Brian said, the sort of secondary and tertiary points, which are more complex, and often you can take a view on brainstorming them or trying to figure these out, but in reality so many of them are data driven now, where you can take, we have a huge database, lots of other companies do, but really we can take 100 or 200 ideal clients for a customer and work backwards and go, right, here are the common points, here's the common demographics, firmographics, here's the common events that have happened. For example, maybe you sell better to companies that are Series A funded, or have used Salesforce, and it's that level that fewer and fewer people do have access to.
And maybe what would your suggestion be to someone that's built this ideal client profile, this great list that they think is going to work? They start going out and it's not working and they need to review it. How do you review that list? How do you review that audience?
I think you'd have to review a few aspects of that. So is it your audience or is it your activity?
Right.
And I think if they have invested time and they're very confident in the list, it's probably not the audience. There's a good chance it might be the channels they're using, and even if they're using the right channels. For example, you might have deliverability challenges that are affecting email, which is probably the kind of bedrock of outreach, that you layer your other activity over and around. And whether or not they might be doing some email and perhaps some other channel activity like maybe LinkedIn connections or social ads or whatever it might be, but the coordination of those might not be there. So let's say they've got a large pool of prospects that they're sort of throwing into different marketing buckets. The actual contact points and the continuity might be 3 or 6 months between being contacted or engaged through one channel and then finding a engagement through another channel and then seeing an ad a few months later. So you need to coordinate and almost sequence on a multi-channel basis for it to really work nowadays. And I think there's some complexity in there that's not obvious off the bat, and it's not easy to implement without either the right systems or the right sort of technical know-how and resource in-house to get it done properly.
I think you've really got to define not working as well, because you could do all of that, and it's something we came across loads of times and had to sort of implement review calls with lots of clients. Go, this doesn't work, and actually you find out clients don't have a sales process. And there's leads getting missed, they're not getting back to customers, and it's not necessarily about just getting replies. You've got to turn that into money, and helping clients set that up is really important. And just having that repeatable process. There are also scenarios where just the product wasn't very good, and you have the best process in the world, but people don't want to buy it, and it's always difficult feedback to have to give. But we have, in more than one occasion, just advised potentially the angle that's being used or the offer or the product itself isn't one that's got wide enough appeal for this kind of channel. Yeah.
It's always interesting, I think, testing that audience and seeing the responses and the success that it's having, and then giving that client feedback. And it's interesting that sometimes it doesn't work, but that advice and feedback is just as valuable for the client to go away and change the targeting maybe slightly or change the offering. So Yeah, super interesting.
Yeah. Reading the responses is always
Exactly.
going to give you that qualitative feedback versus just the numbers.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think you just need to change your expectations and look at things differently as well. For example, there's not a lot of point in looking at, to kind of holistically determine the success of an outreach strategy to any particular audience if you've been running it for 1 month, for example. And you have those sorts of scenarios happening all the time. Increasingly now it's a long game. And to be fair, even for a multi-channel campaign with a number of engagement sequence points, it's probably going to take the best part of 1 to 2 months for even those early prospects to go all the way through that chain, right? So you've got a couple of months for your campaign to get to full speed. You're obviously going to be optimising it that's from data selection perspectives or messaging or timings, or there's a lot of levers at your disposal to improve performance beyond just that layering of volume over the early days. You've got a minimum time frame just to get to performance. But then increasingly what we're seeing is that the success in outreach is coming from a much longer term approach of monitoring intent as you go and building the intent pool and then re-engaging through more premium outreach methods over time. And sometimes it's 6 to 12 months. And that kind of long game mindset, there's no point looking 60 days into a campaign to say, right, should we keep it running or switch it off?
Yeah.
You're kind of looking at the wrong stuff if you do that. So
there's some fairly solid maths behind that as well. I mean, even when we look at our own sales, average time to close is 45 days. And so you think, okay, therefore I should get all my results within 45 days. But actually when you break that down, it works out to just over 50% of sales will close in that time. And then when you look at the numbers, because you measure this as a median, there's a big long gap.
Yeah.
And there's a peak at sort of 90 days. There's another one at like 180 days, and not sort of taking that long view, we'd effectively lose half of our sales.
Great.
And another thing,
Yes.
I think a lot of people don't look at the lead cost either, or they don't look at the lead cost in the right way, because if you take a niche high value proposition, for example, you might be sort of calibrating your expectations based on, well, I can see lots of other outreach campaigns are delivering leads into a business at 2% or 2.5% or 3%, and coming into it with those sorts of expectations. But in reality, it's a niche premium solution. You might be selling into very senior individuals in big companies, and you need to be calibrating those expectations at a much lower lead rate. Obviously high value opportunities offset that when they land, but they're much fewer and further between. And you've got to build that into your model. And I think a good way to sort of set the scene there is if you compare against your other channel costs. So let's take PPC, for example. And in those sorts of scenarios, it's not uncommon to see cost per click at £10 or £20, for example. Websites converting at 1 or 2%. If you take the extremes there, £20 a click at 1% conversion on the website, you're talking about £2,000 a lead. And it would be very rare that an outreach campaign would be delivering leads at over that.
Yeah.
In general,
Very rare.
it's going to be a fraction of that kind of cost. And when you look at that being the alternative in a lot of cases, it's still a no-brainer. If you just got to look at it in the right way.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you both for your ideas and your feedback. So that has been our first session, and thank you very much for watching.
Thanks, Sophie.
Thanks, Sophie.